This is Deputy United States Marshal Bass Reeves. What makes his story so fascinating is the man himself. Bass was born a slave belonging to William Reeves, his son. Reeves was a wealthy plantation owner and politician in Crawford County, Arkansas, and Grayson County, Texas. Bass's daughter Sally said years later that her dad was born in Lamar County, Texas. But regardless, raised as a slave, Bass took his last name from his owner's family name, Reeves, and his first name, Bass, from his granddad, Bass Washington. Working the fields along with his parents, Bass, as a youngster, served as a water boy and a field hand. Later, he would serve as a valet to William Reeves' son, George. In 1863, George Reeves was appointed as a Confederate officer in the 11th Texas Cavalry during the Civil War. There are different stories how Bass gained his freedom. One such story says that he got into it with George over a gambling dispute and beat him up and run away. Seems unlikely to beat up a Confederate colonel during the middle of a war and get away with it. More likely, Bass heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing blacks in certain states and giving them safe haven. At any rate, he headed for Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, where blacks were accepted among the tribes. He managed to pick up enough of their language and customs to get by. In 1864, Bass met Nellie Jenny from Texas. They'll marry and move to Van Buren, Arkansas, where Bass will eventually purchase a farm where he'll become a hard-working, successful farmer. That year in December, Bass and Nellie will have their first child, Sarah, they call Sally. United States Deputy Marshals working for Federal Judge William Story would sometimes hire Bass to go with them into Indian Territory. They knew his knowledge of the land and tribal customs would be an asset. They soon learned that he was an honest and honorable man. His friends would sometimes ask Reeves, "Why would you help the marshals?" He said more than once that he believed in law and order. Without it, folks would have no peace and no freedom from harm. In 1866, their second child was born, Robert. In 1868, another girl, Harriet, was born. In 1870, George was born. In 1872, Alice was born. In 1873, Newland was born. In 1875, the Indian Territory had become so lawless under Federal Judge William Story that the judge and several federal marshals was facing impeachment for corruption. The judge was told, "Retire or be impeached." To replace Judge Story, President Ulysses S. Grant appointed Federal Judge Isaac Charles Parker. President Grant was so determined to clean up the Indian Territory that he gave Judge Parker almost dictatorial powers. During his tenure, he will sentence 160 people to death. And for the first 14 years, the condemned had no rights for appeal, earning Judge Parker the name of the hanging judge. Actually, Judge Parker was opposed to capital punishment. He believed in rehabilitation. His territory covered part of Arkansas and all of Indian Territory. During 21 years on the bench, he tried 13,000 criminal cases. 344 were for murder or rape. Both carried a mandatory sentence of death. He sentenced 160 to be hanged, and only 79 were actually carried out. The district court was moved from Van Buren to Fort Smith under Judge Parker. On May the 10th, 1875, Judge Parker appointed James F. Fagan, federal marshal, with power to hire 200 deputy marshals to tame the 75,000 square miles of Indian Territory. Marshal Fagan appointed such deputies as Heck Thomas, Bud Ledbetter, and Bill Tillman, who became famous lawmen enforcing federal law in Indian Territory. Judge Parker also ordered Marshal Fagan to hire 20 black deputy marshals. Bass Reeves was among the first to be hired from recommendations of marshals that he had worked for. A few of the other black marshals was Deed Rogers, Bob Fortune, Bill Colbert, Neely Factor, Zeke Moore, and Grant Johnson. Marshal Bass Reeves will serve as U.S. Deputy Marshal for 32 years. He was the only marshal that started with Judge Parker in 1875 and ended when Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. From 1875 until 1907, 120 U.S. deputy marshals lost their life enforcing the law in Indian Territory. Indian Territory was the most dangerous place for deputies in the entire nation. Marshals would leave the federal court in Fort Smith, and Judge Parker's courtroom was located on the second floor on the right, and prisoners was housed on the bottom floor under the courtroom, described as hell on the border. Marshal Reeves would leave Fort Smith with a cook and one assistant called a posseman that would usually guard any prisoners taken by the marshal. They would take a prison wagon to keep prisoners in. Prisoners would be chained together with a long chain, and it'd be connected to the back axle of the prison wagon. One of Reeves's kids said that their dad would not let them play with the dog that he had. It was trained, he said, to guard prisoners. Marshal Reeves would travel starting at Fort Smith to Fort Reno to Fort Seals, Indian Territory. His round trip would usually be from 600 to 800 miles, taking 2 to 3 months. Outlaws knew the route that Bass would take, and they had tacked notes on trees threatening his life if he pursued them. He collected the notes and showed them to reporters years later. Bass would sometimes leave the wagon 2 or 3 days searching for outlaws that he had warrants for. But he always knew where the prison wagon was supposed to be, so that he could bring the prisoners back to the wagon. The wagon would pick up prisoners in local jails being held for federal court. Federal marshals could only arrest whites and blacks or Indians only if they broke federal law. The tribes had their own police force. Now, this is a group of tribal police that would help marshals capture Indian felons when they broke federal law by harming a white or black citizen. Deputy marshals was not paid a salary. They was paid for every warrant served and $2 per arrest, regardless of if it was a bootlegger or a murderer. The deputies received 6 cents per mile for going to the place of arrest and 10 cents per mile plus 10 cents to feed the prisoners being returned to court in Fort Smith. If a deputy killed a suspect during an attempted arrest, he had to bury the suspect at his own expense, unless he could find a family or friend to do it. On one trip, Marshal Reeves returned to Fort Smith with 16 prisoners. He was making more arrests and more money than most others. If there was a reward on a prisoner, the marshal could collect it. Judge Parker considered Bass as one of his most productive marshals. In 1876, Bass and Nellie had their 7th child, Edgar. And in 1878, it'll be another girl, Lula. In 1880, on June the 2nd, the census in Van Buren showed 40-year-old Bass Reeves and 30-year-old Nellie Jennings Reeves, along with 8 children ranging from age 2 to 16. Bass's mother and his mother's sister Jane also lived with the Bass family. When Marshal Reeves would leave Fort Smith on his way to Indian Territory, he would carry several warrants issued by the court. Bass would memorize each warrant and description. He was unable to read the warrants he was serving. They said he never failed to produce the right warrant for the right felon. Bass and Nellie would have 3 more kids: Benjamin in 1880, Homer in 1882, and Bass Jr. in 1887, with a total of 11 kids, 6 boys, 5 girls. In 1883, on one of Marshal Reeves' trips into Indian Territory, he was given a warrant for the arrest of outlaw Belle Starr and her husband Sam Starr for horse theft. Belle knew Bass and they liked each other, so he told her, if you would turn yourself in at Fort Smith, she wouldn't have to ride hundreds of miles in a prison wagon chained to criminals. She agreed and went to Fort Smith and turned herself in. On March 8, 1883, Belle and Sam was convicted of stealing 2 horses in Judge Parker's court and sentenced to 1 year in federal prison. Judge Parker liked Belle, and some say it was a light sentence. She made arrangements for her family and friends to care for her kids. Belle was out in 9 months for good behavior. Sam, not so soon. In 1884, while Marshal Reeves was traveling the Seminole Whiskey Trail with warrants for 2 white men and 2 black desperados, when his pursuit was interrupted by 3 brothers named Brunter. They had been accused of horse stealing, robbery, and several unsolved murders, and thought that Bass was after them. They stopped him and ordered him to dismount and keep his hands away from his 2 Colt revolvers he always wore. He asked them for a pencil, said he needed to put the date on government papers showing the date that he had arrested him. They began laughing so hard they relaxed their guard. Marshal Reeves took advantage, drawing his Colts and killing 2 while the 3rd brother shot and missed. Bass killed all 3. With no warrants having been served or sworn out for the Brunter brothers, Bass received no money for this encounter. Also in 1884, while on a trip through the Chickasaw Nation, Reeves shot and killed his cook, William Lynch, while Reeves and his posse was camped near the Canadian River. Reeves, it has been said, had a few words to say about Leach's cooking. When Leach took exception and poured hot grease on a puppy that Reeves had in camp, the marshal got mad and shot the cook. He sent one of his posse men after a doctor, but it was too late. An inquest was held later and found him to be innocent. The next year in 1885, near what is now Eufaula, Oklahoma, 19-year-old Robert Reeves, Bass's oldest son, was serving as a posse man for his dad. When a prisoner grabbed the gun from the prison wagon driver, he shot at the driver as the driver was running away, then grabbed an axe and threatened Robert. Bass will recapture the prisoner after the prisoner tried to shoot the marshal 3 times, but his gun misfired, and then he tried to pistol whip Marshal Reeves before he was subdued. Robert will later give up working for his dad and get a job with the Central Arkansas and Houston Railroad as a brakeman. He'll be killed on the 14th of July, 1893, at the age of 26 when coupling up 2 boxcars. Now, Bass was known for using disguises. Most people had heard of Bass Reeves, but didn't know what he looked like. He once disguised himself as a poor criminal running from the law, and being accepted by the outlaws he was hunting, he was able to arrest them. The marshal once investigated a suspect that had hacked a man to death. When he located his subject, the man had 2 campfires burning, one under a tree and the other out in the open. Bass asked the man, why 2 fires, and why build one under a tree? Not getting a good answer, he put out the fire under the tree and dug under the ashes and found the bloody axe. Judge Parker convicted the man, and he was hanged in Fort Smith. Although it had been 2 years since Bass shot the cook, the federal marshal had been replaced by an ex-Confederate who reinstated charges of murder in January of 1886 for Leach's murder. Bass was arrested by Marshal G.I.B. Freyer. His gun and badge was taken away. He was placed in the same jail held on the border with some of the same prisoners that he had arrested. Judge Parker was determined to get Reeves out as soon as possible and still keep the integrity of the court. Even at that, it was a couple of weeks before bail could be posted. The jail located beneath Judge Parker's courtroom held 50 prisoners with no heat and no cross ventilation or outdoor plumbing. A bucket was used for waste and set in the fireplace for the fumes to go up the chimney. Prisoners slept on mats on the concrete floor. Trial would take place on 17 October 1887 in Judge Parker's court. Bass hired ex-U.S. Attorney William H. Clayton to defend him. The prosecution will call 11 witnesses, and the defense will call 10. It'll be discovered during trial that Bass and his cook, William Leach, had been in the field for 2 months without a cross word between them. They had 9 prisoners. They were taken to Fort Smith. Most of the witnesses for the prosecution was the prisoners arrested by Marshal Reeves. It was also established that the prisoners were in the prison tent and couldn't have seen the incident. One prisoner with a minor charge was accompanied by his wife. She testified for the defense that she saw what happened. The marshal and the cook were sitting around the campfire. Bass looked like he was cleaning his gun or working on it when it went off, hitting Mr. Leach in the neck. Marshal Reeves sent her husband for the doctor. He was unable to find one, so they took him to Fort Smith, where he died a few days later. Bass will be found innocent, and Judge Parker will restore his badge, gun, and position. In order to pay the attorney, Bass sold his home in Van Buren and moved his family to North 12th Street, Park Place in Fort Smith. Family members asked Bass, "Why do you put yourself in danger enforcing white man's laws?" His answer was, "Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the only one we have, and without it, we've got nothing." Once again, Marshal Reeves began bringing in desperados and villains by the dozens, earning good money. And in 1889, newly appointed Chief U.S. Marshal Jacob Yose sent Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves after a gang of killers that had killed Deputy Marshal Joseph Lundy on June 14, 1889. On December the 30th that year, Chief Marshal Yose received a message from Bass Reeves. "I've got the 3 men that killed Deputy Marshal Lundy, bringing them in." In April of 1890, Reeves captured and brought in the notorious Seminole Indian Greenleaf, who had murdered 3 white men and 4 Indians, and had been on the run for 18 years without capture, and this was the first time to be arrested. In 1893, Marshal Reeves was transferred to the Eastern District Federal Court located in Paris, Texas. The Tom Story Gang stole horses from Indian Territory and would sell them in Texas. When Story changed his operation and decided to steal horses from a local Texas Ranger, George Delaney, and take his horses into Indian Territory and sell them there, Delaney knew it was the Tom Story gang that stole his horses, so he went to federal court in Paris to swear out a warrant. The case was assigned to Bass Reeves. Knowing Story would have to cross the Red River on his way back to Texas at Delaware Bend Crossing, Bass and Mr. Delaney camped on the river 4 days waiting for Story to return. When he did, he still had 2 of Delaney's best mules that he couldn't sell. Deputy Marshal Reeves stepped out from behind the bushes and announced that Story was under arrest. Story thought that Marshal Reeves was far enough from him that he would miss if he shot at him. Story grabbed for his gun, and Bass and Delaney buried Tom Story where he fell, and George Delaney took his 2 mules home. On 19 March 1896, Bass Reeves lost his wife, Nellie, to cancer when she was 55 years old. Nellie Jenny Reeves was buried in Fort Smith, Arkansas at the Oak Cemetery. The next year after Nellie's death, Bass was transferred to Muskogee Federal Court to work under U.S. Marshal Leo E. Bennett. Muskogee had city police and 2 U.S. deputy marshals, Bass Reeves and David Adams, serving as Reeves's posse man. On August 3, 1899, Bass's 18-year-old daughter Lula passed away from epilepsy. She's buried at the Oak Cemetery in Fort Smith, close to her mother Nellie. 4 years after Nellie's death, in 1900, Bass, at the age of 62, will marry Winnie Sumner in Muskogee. Winnie had been married once before and had a daughter. The next year, in 1901, on October the 19th, Bass and Nellie's 14-year-old son, Bass Jr., will pass away and be buried at Green Hill Cemetery in Muskogee. After being married to Winnie for 2 years, in 1902, Bass will return to Muskogee with 2 prisoners when he will receive the bad news from Marshal Leo Bennett. Bass's son Benjamin, that Bass called Benny, had a murder warrant for killing his wife that had been lying on Marshal Bennett's desk for 2 days. In respect for Deputy Marshal Reeves, the other law officers refused to accept the warrant. This is one act of Bass Reeves serving the warrant for murder on his own son, to me makes Deputy Marshal Reeves the most honorable law officer to ever wear a badge in the Old West, knowing he was bringing his son before 12 men that would certainly find him guilty of murder. Judge Parker sentenced Benny to life in prison at the federal penitentiary in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, instead of the gallows. After 12 years at Leavenworth, Benny will have his sentence commuted and released, after a petition was circulated for his release. Benny will become a good citizen for the rest of his life, and he'll eventually marry again. The tragedy is that his dad, Bass Reeves, would not live to see his son released from jail, always believing he had placed his son in prison for life. When Bass was asked about the murder his son committed, he said that Benny had married a beautiful 22-year-old Creek girl named Castilla Brown. He had caught her in bed with another man. He forgave her. Then he caught her again with another man. Benny shot her and beat up the man. When Bass was asked what would he have done, he said, "I would have shot the man and whooped the hell out of her." The same year, in May of 1902, Marshal Reeves and posseman David Adams was sent to Bragg, Oklahoma, to quell racial strife between blacks and whites. Bass stopped the riots by arresting 15 white men and 8 black men and took them to federal jail in Muskogee. The next year, Bass's son, Homer, passed away on December 28, 1903 at the age of 21. Homer's buried at the Green Hill Cemetery in Muskogee. In 1907, the Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma. The federal jurisdiction was ended. Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves retired with 32 years service at the age of 69. He was the only deputy marshal to start with Judge Parker and continue until statehood. When Bass retired in 1907 in Muskogee, his 87-year-old mother was still alive and living in Fort Smith. Marshal Reeves made over 3,000 criminal arrests during his tenure. He was hit over the head, shot at from ambush, bullets tore through his hat, his coat, and cut in the reins out of his hands. But he was never hit. In the commission of his duties, he killed 14 men in gunfights in the process of making an arrest, always given a chance to surrender. He was reported to be polite, with the mannerisms of still being a slave, but having the power and authority of the federal court behind him, with the power to arrest white, black, and Indians alike. He will serve 2 years with the Muskogee Police Department before his health begins to decline. In 1992, Marshal Reeves was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. After a short illness on the 12th of January 1910, while living at 816 North Howard Street in Muskogee, U.S. Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves passed away from Bright's disease, a disease of the kidneys. Marshal Reeves is buried at the Old Union Cemetery in Muskogee, Oklahoma. The location of his grave, sadly, is unknown. He was 71 years old.
Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.